Spring, 1942. The fields of Fort Knox, Kentucky, shimmered under the midday sun. On opposite ends of an 8-mile stretch, two men stood facing destiny. Each held in their hands a radio that could change the way wars were fought. One of them, Daniel Noble, pressed a single switch and spoke into the handset. His voice, crisp, steady, and without the faintest trace of static, carried through the air with astonishing clarity. 8 miles away, his colleague Henry Magnuski smiled as every word came through perfectly. The U.S. Army had demanded a range of 3 miles. Noble's team had just doubled it. That day marked more than a successful field test. It was the quiet dawn of a revolution in battlefield communication. Until then, soldiers had shouted, "Run!" or prayed their fragile AM radios would work. But this was different. This was FM, frequency modulation, the same principle that would later give civilians crystal-clear music over their car radios. And in war, it would do something far more profound. It would save lives. The radio they tested that spring would become known as the SCR-300, the first true walkie-talkie. It would let American troops talk clearly across hills, through forests and over miles of chaos. Generals would later call it the single most useful piece of communication equipment in the European theater. Yet, this moment of triumph had its roots not in Kentucky, but 2 years earlier in a Chicago laboratory, and in one man's refusal to follow the rules. In September 1940, Daniel Earl Noble walked through the doors of Galvin Manufacturing Corporation as its new director of research. Born in Connecticut, Noble was no stranger to radio waves. He'd already built the country's first statewide FM police communication network, a project for the Connecticut State Police that stunned engineers with its clarity and reliability. He knew what FM could do, how it shrugged off static, how it cut through noise like a blade through fog. When Noble arrived at Galvin, the world was on the brink. France had fallen. Britain was battered. And though America hadn't yet joined the war, everyone knew it was coming. The U.S. Army was rushing to modernize, scrambling to prepare for a conflict that would stretch across continents. And one of its weakest links, perhaps its most fatal, was communication. In the late 1930s, the Army had tried to give soldiers portable radios, the SCR-194 and SCR-195, but those sets were temperamental, fragile, and based on old AM technology. Every nearby engine, every thunderstorm, even the hum of an electric motor could drown them out. Soldiers distrusted them so deeply that many officers preferred to send human runners across open ground, rather than rely on a radio. It was safer to trust a man's legs than a radio's hiss. Galvin Manufacturing, known today as Motorola, had already impressed the Army once with a small handheld AM radio, the SCR-536, nicknamed the Handy Talkie. Compact, one-handed, and clever in design, it was a solid step forward. But its maximum range was barely 1 mile. Beyond that, voices faded into static. It could handle platoon-level communication, but not the kind of coordination modern war demanded. When Noble and Galvin's chief engineer, Don Mitchell, presented the SCR-536 to the Signal Corps at Fort Monmouth, the Army was pleased, but blunt. "We need something better," they said. "Something that can reach 5 miles, maybe 10. Something soldiers can carry." The Army issued specifications for a new radio, a portable AM transmitter receiver. That made sense. The military trusted AM. They'd trained on it, built infrastructure around it, stocked warehouses with parts for it. AM was safe, predictable, and proven. FM was not. But Noble didn't care about safe. When he met with the Signal Corps in Washington, Noble did something almost unthinkable for a civilian engineer speaking to the Army brass. He told them they were making a mistake. AM, he said, was doomed to fail on the battlefield. If they wanted reliability, real reliability, They needed to take a chance on FM. It was a bold move, bordering on reckless. But Noble backed it with science, conviction, and results. FM, he explained, rejected interference. Where AM was overwhelmed by static, FM cut through it. Where AM faded, FM stayed strong to the edge of its range. And though it required more bandwidth, more complex circuitry, and more precise tuning, its benefits in battle would outweigh every cost. Major James O'Connell of the Signal Corps listened carefully. He'd seen what AM radios could and couldn't do. Noble's confidence and his proven track record swayed him. The Army took the gamble. They issued a contract to Galvin Manufacturing for a new FM portable radio. It would be called the SCR 300. Back in Chicago, Noble assembled a dream team. At the core was Henry Magnuski, a Polish immigrant and radio genius. Alongside him were engineers Marion Bond, Lloyd Morris, and Bill Vogel. Together, they faced a list of requirements that bordered on impossible. The radio had to be battery-powered and weigh less than 35 pounds. It had to work through rain, trees, and mud. It needed at least a 3-mile range, ideally more. It had to tune across 40 to 48 megacycles and use no more than 2 frequency crystals, which were scarce in wartime. And it had to be simple enough for a tired, terrified infantryman to use in the middle of battle. One morning, Noble called Magnuski and a young engineer named Andy Affronti to his desk. He laid down a single sheet of paper, the official Signal Corps specification. "Gentlemen," he said quietly, "this is a life-and-death priority. Start immediately." The 2 engineers stared at the paper. Every line on it was a challenge. Together, they began to design what would become the most iconic field radio of the war. The team worked night and day. They built circuits that tuned transmitter and receiver with a single knob. No more fumbling with 2 controls. They added automatic frequency control so soldiers wouldn't have to adjust dials under fire. They invented a squelch circuit to silence background noise when no one was talking, sparing operators from the constant hiss that plagued AM radios. And somehow, they made it all work on portable battery power. By late 1941, they had their prototype. It was sturdy, waterproof, and astonishingly advanced. In early 1942, the Army scheduled field trials at Fort Knox. 2 prototypes were tested over increasing distances until they reached 8 miles apart. The voices came through loud and clear. When the Signal Corps officers saw it for themselves, they gave immediate approval. The SCR 300 had passed every test, and then some. Production began, and soon the radio was ready for war. Its official designation, the BC-1000, included the radio set, handset, antenna, and backpack harness. Slightly heavier than the 35-pound target, about 38 pounds with batteries, it was still accepted. The Army didn't care about a few extra pounds. What mattered was that it worked. To prove it in the field, Noble, Vogel, and Bob Galvin, son of company founder Paul Galvin, brought 2 units to Fort Knox for final testing. The infantry board, famous for rejecting overhyped equipment, watched closely. The radios were dropped, soaked, and shaken. They still worked. Even surrounded by running engines and roaring vehicles, their FM signals stayed clear. By the end of the trials, the skeptical officers were nodding in approval. One even said, "This thing actually works." With that endorsement, production orders poured in. Nearly 50,000 units would be built before the war's end. They would travel with soldiers across the world, from the steaming jungles of the Pacific to the snow-choked forests of Europe. The SCR 300 first saw combat in August 1943, during the brutal campaign for New Georgia in the Solomon Islands. The Pacific jungles were notorious for killing radios. The humidity corroded circuits, fungus grew on wires, and thick vegetation devoured radio waves. Colonel Ankenbrandt, the theater signal officer, doubted the new FM set would survive. But after seeing it in action, his doubts vanished. "The SCR 300, he wrote to General Meade, is exactly what is needed for frontline communications. Soldiers agreed. For the first time, commanders could coordinate attacks in real time. Artillery could be called in precisely, not by guesswork. When units got separated in the jungle, they could still reach each other. The only real problem was batteries. The tropical heat drained them fast. But that was a small price to pay for something that actually worked. Lieutenant Joseph Dooley of the 298th Infantry summed it up best in his field report. It's an infantryman's dream. In Europe, the SCR-300 made its debut during the invasion of Italy. Radio operators, soaked and staggering under the 35-pound packs, waded ashore through the surf at Salerno, shells bursting all around them. Even in the chaos, they kept communications alive. Commanders could talk to battalion HQ miles behind the beaches. For the first time, advancing troops didn't disappear into radio silence. Artillery observers called in fire missions with stunning precision. They could see enemy positions, transmit coordinates instantly, and watch shells fall exactly where they needed. The old delays, the static, the garbled numbers, the wasted minutes, were gone. The SCR-300 had given the Allies something the enemy didn't yet have: seamless coordination in the middle of chaos. By the time of D-Day, June 6, 1944, the SCR-300 had become standard issue. Thousands were packed aboard the ships bound for Normandy. As the first waves hit Omaha and Utah Beach, radio operators carried the sets through seawater, gunfire, and smoke. And somehow, their voices still carried through the noise, perfectly clear. The FM signal cut through the electromagnetic storm of battle. The roar of engines, the crack of artillery, the hum of generators. AM radios would have been useless there, but the SCR-300 worked flawlessly. Commanders on the beaches talked directly to ships offshore, calling in naval gunfire to crush German bunkers. And as the Allies pushed inland through the hedgerows of Normandy, the SCR-300's relay feature, the ability for one radio to automatically retransmit another signal, proved priceless. Even when terrain blocked direct line of sight, communication continued. Battalion could reach regiment, regiment could reach division, and coordination remained unbroken. By June 21st, just 15 days after D-Day, Allied headquarters requested 200 more SCR-300s to replace battle losses. Soldiers were demanding them faster than they could be delivered. By war's end, Noble's radio had become the unseen heartbeat of the Allied advance. A steady, clear voice guiding tanks, troops, and aircraft through some of history's fiercest battles. From the Pacific Islands to the streets of Paris, the SCR-300 allowed armies to move, react, and adapt with a speed no enemy could match. And behind that success stood one man's conviction: Daniel Noble's refusal to settle for good enough. When he told the Army to abandon AM, he wasn't just making a technical argument. He was making a statement of belief that technology should serve soldiers, not limit them. That innovation, when guided by purpose, could change the course of history. After the war, Galvin Manufacturing adopted a new name, Motorola, a nod to its radio heritage. The company would go on to lead the world into the age of mobile communication, from car radios to the cell phones we carry today. But it all began with that moment in Kentucky, when two engineers stood 8 miles apart and heard each other clearly across the air. The SCR-300 didn't just win battles, it connected people. It turned chaos into coordination. And in doing so, it proved that sometimes the most decisive weapon on the battlefield isn't a gun, it's a voice.